Hello, my name is Dylan Jerome. Today we are going to talk about organic Legos or cells, the building blocks of life. As you may or may not know, all living things are made of cells, from plants to animals and everything in between. So from there, I want to ask a couple questions. Quickly, what are houses made of? Think about the different aspects that go into a house that all work together to make it a house. Same thing with cars. There are lots of different parts that work together to build a car. But now that we think about things a little bit differently, let's take a look at life. What are plants made of? Are they made of the same kinds of things as houses and cars? Yes and no. And more importantly, what are we made of? The term cells was first used by Thomas Hooke in 1665. Hooke began doing simple experiments using lenses he created in his lab. He began putting things, different plant materials, rocks, and other things underneath his microscopes and taking a look at what made them. And he ended up calling the small constituent pieces cells because they reminded him most of honeybee cells in a beehive. And he found that cells are the smallest unit of life. And not only that, but there are very many kinds of cells. Specifically, there are two kinds of cells, plant cells and animal cells. Now this is a very big simplification, but it gets to the main idea that all life is made up of these two things. So how do we know this? Well, like I said before, Thomas Hooke began doing experiments using very rudimentary forms of microscopes. Some of the first microscopes, as seen in the top left, designed by Hooke, used a simple spherical lens and were illuminated using a candle. From here, he was able to make hundreds of different designs of microscopes and actually kept most of them secret when other scientists would come to look at his work. He decided it was better to have the secrecy and yet be able to get out the knowledge than it was for everyone to copy him and maybe discredit it. From there, we have developed much more intricate microscopes. As you can see in the second image here, we have a regular compound microscope that uses mirrors and lights to do the same job that the first microscope, Hooke's, did in the top image. But this one is much more unique and much more detailed than the first one. It allows looking at things much simpler, and it doesn't even need to use a candle. From there, we have also continued to develop microscopes and have gone on to look at things smaller than cells. And we won't talk about that very much at all today, but things that are smaller than cells are called electrons and atoms and all of those tinier things that make up matter. And those sorts of things are looked at using an electron microscope that must be hooked to many different computers and uses a much different form of imagery than what we're going to talk about. But a very good diagram of our regular compound microscope is seen right here. So basically, the most fundamental aspect of a microscope is that it magnifies whatever it is you're looking at. It does that by having light go through a small glass lens normally. It doesn't always have to be glass. There are other sorts of things that we use, but glass is the most normal. And is then magnified due to refraction. The first inventor of the microscope is still in question today, as we don't have a specific date that it was written down. But it's between Hooke and a couple of his contemporaries. But we do know that they were developed in the early 1620s and used throughout history since then to continue our investigation of the microscopic world. So, there are a couple differences in cells that make them unique. Some organisms, are composed of single cells. They live their entire life being made of only one single cell that carries out all of the objectives required for life. Respiration, feeding, waste excretion, those sorts of things. Normally, these cells that are unicellular live their entire life on their own. They might run into or interact with other cells, but sometime throughout history, single-celled organisms began to coalesce and become groups of cells. And those led to plant cells and animal cells that, while are small single building blocks, they have specific building blocks that carry out specific jobs. So what are some of the differences and what are some of the similarities between an animal cell and a plant cell? Well, we can take a look. Some of the things they have in common: all animal and plant cells have cytoplasm. That is the gooey material that makes up the majority of the mass of a cell, and it's the liquid inside of it that gives it a little bit of shape and that the rest of the organelles float around. A nucleus is shared by both of them, as is the cell membrane. The nucleus carries out the brain operations of a single cell and allows it to produce and do the jobs it needs to do. As you can see, a plant cell also has a cellulose cell wall that gives it rigidity and structure, and animal cells have a cell membrane which gives it some structure, but nowhere near as much as a cell wall. And as you may or may not have heard, the mitochondria in here, these little pink things, are the powerhouse of the cell in that they carry out the majority of the metabolism. Mitochondria metabolize things in cells. As you can see, there are a couple other things inside plant cells, such as chloroplasts, which carry out photosynthesis and produce energy in the cell, and animal cells do not have these chloroplasts. Groups of cells eventually started working together to make much more complex organisms. These groups of cells are made into different structures. A small group is called a tissue, but also, as we talked about, there are some lone cells. So, thinking about this, I need you to take a second to go ahead and write down your answers. Why might cells exist? What is it that makes such a simple organism able to make so many complex things? Also, what kinds of things or jobs might these cells do? But also, where do new cells come from? So to take a look at that last question for just a second, cells split. Without going into too much detail, most cells undergo a reproductive stage that allows them to cut themselves in half and create a perfect copy of themselves, or a near perfect copy, to carry out the same functions that it did. So a specific animal muscle cell will always produce other muscle cells. Enough of these cells make up a tissue. So if cells are just the building block, the tissues would be like the drywall that goes in your house. So it is made up of individual pieces that go together to make a form in a flat piece. Well, tissues are similar in that they are a group of cells working together to perform a similar task. Many of these tissues are things like muscle tissue, lung tissue, other sorts of organ tissues, and using that word to describe them actually leads to the next step of cell unification, an organ. Groups of tissues work together to create an organ that produces a specific job in a body or digests specific things and carries out specific functions. Those organs work together to make systems, such as the digestive system, the endocrine system, the circulatory system, different aspects of a human body that must work together, even among systems, to keep the organism alive. And then from those systems and organ systems becomes the organism, or you. So, another quick write real quick. What groups of systems do you belong to? Not just cell systems, obviously. Do you belong to any sports, clubs, teams, scouts, Girl or Boy Scouts? Those sorts of things. So in also what ways are you like a single cell going through the world performing your own position or duties? But also in what ways are you like a tissue cell or a cell that's made into a group of cells and must work together with others to do a specific job? So if you could, go ahead and write down a couple ideas about what makes you both a single cell and a group cell. So these types of group cells all have specific jobs, and every cell has a job. These types of jobs are to do things such as send energy from one cell to another, such as neurons in the brain, They send small electrical signals that tell the body what to do. They can also send information, be it genetic information on how to reproduce or what kinds of cells to produce. And they can also add structure to something, such as bone cells, which give us rigidity and allow us to stand up, despite our muscles and the weight of gravity pulling down on us. So, what other jobs might cells do? If you could, go ahead and just jot down a couple ideas that you think you might have. In general, the life of a cell, a single cell, is relatively short, and that can range quite significantly. The lifetime of a single human skin cell, for example, is normally only around 2 weeks, whereas a liver cell might live as long as 18 months. Now that's generally short-lived in comparison to the organism, but like I said, your entire body goes through large stages of waves of these cells and reproduces them and replaces them very regularly. So most cells try to reproduce before death in order to maintain that same number, or at least the same structure. But sometimes these cause issues with replication, and those issues are called mutations. And mutations can lead to some diseases, such as cancers and other things, and we'll talk about that some other time. One last thing to think about, though, are cells in you. You are made up of billions of cells. And many, many cells are replaced each minute within your own body. You won't notice it or even think about it, but your skin is regularly replaced, as are your nails, your organ cells, and everything that makes you you. So, could we have life without cells? And also, one last thing to think about, are there any cells you think you might not need? So go ahead and write that down real quick and turn it in at the end. And I hope that we just scratched the surface of cells here and that you might have some questions that we'll talk about at another time. Thank you so much. Goodbye.